is the year 1520, and the winds of empire are shifting. Portugal has risen as the dominant naval power in Europe, sending ships across vast oceans in search of gold, spices, and human lives. These ships, drenched in salt rot and sorrow, cut through the Atlantic, bearing cargo, weapons, and chains. And you are not a sailor. You are not a merchant. You are a fugitive, fleeing death, fleeing your name, fleeing a life that never belonged to you. One night, under cover of darkness, you slipped into the cargo hold of a Portuguese slave ship, bound for Angola, hoping to vanish with the tide. But you are not alone in the belly of this ship. Eyes watch you from the dark. Breath is held behind locked jaws. And somewhere below, truth waits chained silent and impossible to ignore. If you're drawn to haunting emotional stories rooted in real history stories that whisper what textbooks forget, then subscribe to this channel and stay close. A simple like or comment goes a long way in helping us keep these voices alive. Now, come aboard, step below deck, and prepare to witness a side of the past that still echoes in the waves. The shadows aboard the vessel cling to you as tightly as the ragged cloak you've pulled around your shoulders, and though the stink of salted fish, damp wood, and tarred rope fills your nose with a pungent misery, your trembling lungs greedily accept each cautious breath. You dare not move. The darkness is your armor, silence your only ally. Just minutes before you'd scaled the anchor rope under cover of nightfall, your heart pounding in your chest, every pulse a prayer that none of the crew would glimpse the shape of your desperation against the moonlit horizon. The ship had looked harmless from the dockside, an aged Portuguese carrack, broad-shouldered, sturdy, weathered like a farmer, after too many summers beneath an unforgiving sun. But now, from your hiding place in the cargo hold, you sense an unease that seems to seep out from every crevice, every damp corner of the ship, whispering secrets the sea would rather swallow whole. You lean back, pressing your spine against the hard edge of a barrel, and gently ease your breath from tight lips, letting it mix silently into the air that tastes faintly of salt and something metallic, something unsettlingly human. There's a brief pang of regret, not strong enough to send you scrambling back to shore, but present enough to nag like the dull ache of a neglected wound. The debts you fled were no mere handful of coins owed to tavern keepers or gamblers. These were sums tallied in pride threats, measured out in bruises and payments collected in blood. Even now, with the groaning of the ship's hull, your only company, you feel safer hidden here beneath rough timbers than you ever had sleeping under your own roof, haunted by the footsteps of creditors growing louder each day. Time begins to lose its shape as you crouch, your muscles stiffening like old leather, drying too quickly in the sun. Each creak of wood, each distant murmur from the deck above, is amplified by your isolation into echoes of imminent discovery. Soon you learn the rhythm of the ship, a heaving, sighing symphony, a living creature carrying you toward an unknown horizon. Only gradually do you begin to distinguish the different layers of sound footsteps, deliberate and heavy, belonging to the captain. Perhaps softer scurries of cabin boys scuttling about their tasks, and the tense snapping of sails, tightened by men whose names you'll never know. But amid these familiar maritime noises, you begin to discern something else, a quieter, persistent note woven subtly beneath the others. Chains. At first, you mistake them for the clinking of metal lanterns swaying with the ocean's gentle roll. Yet as you tilt your head, honing your hearing like a starving animal seeking prey, there's no mistaking the rhythmic clink, clink, clink. Chains indeed, and many of them resonating softly from somewhere deeper below deck, a muffled chorus that pulses quietly, relentlessly through the ship. Curiosity claws gently at your chest, cautious yet insistent, leading your eyes toward the hold's slatted wooden wall. Beyond it, a faint glow of lantern light spills through narrow gaps in the timbers. Swallowing thickly, you press your face close to the crack and peer through. At first, your vision struggles with the dark, your mind slow to shape sense from shadow. But gradually, your eyes adapt, and shapes begin to emerge, dark forms, lying or sitting, huddled in rows along the hold's floor, bound at ankles and wrists by heavy iron shackles. Bodies shifting slightly slowly, as if even the smallest movement exacts a painful price. You see the outlines of figures slumped in exhaustion, their heads bowed in an acceptance deeper and darker than sleep. Your breath catches lodged like ice in your throat. The murmurs you thought you heard are not creaks of timbers or whispers of sailors, but soft whispered prayers spoken in languages you don't recognize, rising like smoke into the still air. Each voice is a frail thread spun from the spindle of despair, floating up toward the planks above, hoping to slip quietly from the ship's suffocating embrace. The realization of what lies chained below you sweeps through your mind like seawater flooding a breached hull, cold and bitter and relentless. You'd known about slave ships. Of course, every dockside tavern held whispered conversations, hushed rumors of gold earned from human suffering. But you'd thought those vessels sailed other oceans, touched shores, far removed from your tiny, miserable world. Now as you watch, silent and hidden guilt blooms hotly in your gut, fueled by the shock of witnessing suffering so casually packed away beneath salted cod and barrels of rum. A soft noise distracts your attention. One prisoner shifts position, and for a fraction of a heartbeat, his eyes seem to catch yours through the wooden slats. A flash of dim lantern light reveals the face of a boy, perhaps a few years younger than yourself, thin and taut like dried parchment stretched over bones. His stare is unwavering, defiant in its resignation, and seems to challenge the very choice you've made to hide, to escape your own troubles by stowing away aboard this ship of souls bound for unknown torments. Though he does not call out, does not raise alarm, his eyes speak a quiet accusation that burrows into you, lodging itself deep between your ribs. It's as though he sees straight into your shame, your cowardice, your willingness to trade one cruel world for another, so long as your own neck might be spared. You pull back sharply, unable to bear the intensity of his stare. Shivering, you sink lower into your hiding place, head resting heavily upon your knees. Sleep does not come easy. Dreams are shallow things here, skimming restlessly across the surface of your mind, like shadows chased by flickering lamplight. You drift uneasily between wakefulness and sleep, aware always of the groaning hull, the ever-present sound of chains, and the boy's unspoken judgment that hangs like a fog in the air around you. Hours, or perhaps days, pass. Time slips away, meaningless, beneath decks counted only in quiet breaths and the passing of sailors' boots above your head. Gradually, the air thickens further, souring with sweat, unwashed bodies, and sickness. The hold, once merely unpleasant, becomes oppressive, heavy with the scent of suffering and the beginnings of illness, something you remember clearly from your village when the fever took hold of houses and never let go. This scent of growing despair seeps into your bones, fills your lungs, becomes as much a part of you as your heartbeat. You begin to consider the darkness around you differently, no longer a mere hiding place, but a weight pressing down upon your chest, a reminder of your complicity in this grim passage. You fled your debts to save your skin, only to realize you've stepped willingly into a far darker debt, one owed to humanity itself. Yet even as you recognize this bitter truth, your courage fails to rise to meet it. leaving you feeling as helplessly chained as those bound souls below you. Yet through the dread pressing in from every shadowed corner, something within you stirs. A quiet, persistent thought whispers gently, almost lovingly into your exhausted mind. Survival may have brought you aboard, but perhaps it's destiny that's kept you hidden here, where your witness might become more than just the eyes of one frightened stowaway. Outside your cramped sanctuary, the ship's timbers groan and sigh softly once more, as though the very vessel herself breathes, sensing your quiet resolve. And as you close your eyes, you feel strangely seen, not by those who would punish you, but by something deeper. Older, kinder perhaps, and far less forgiving. As the ship carries you further from shore, further from all you've known, you sense you are not merely hiding. You are waiting caught in the gentle sway of the sea, a witness held captive by your conscience and chained by the choices still to come. Darkness teaches its own language. You no longer measure time by the position of the sun or the shifting of shadows. Instead, your days are counted in footsteps, boot heels dragging tiredly when the crew finishes their shifts, bare soles padding softly in the hours when everyone pretends to sleep, and the sharp, deliberate stride of the officer who never misses his patrol, even when the rain drums heavy above. The hold has become your small, splintered world, and within it, your senses have sharpened to a strange kind of poetry. You can tell who is walking by the sound of their breathing. You know which plank creaks when pressed by a left foot. You know when someone is pausing to listen and when someone is pausing to forget. But it is the silence that grows most dangerous. For in the quiet, you begin to hear your own thoughts too clearly. You remember the names of the men you owe their snarls, their threats. You remember the night your mother's rosary slipped from your palm as you fled beads scattering across the cobbled street like seeds unwilling to root. And you remember the eyes of the boy in the hold, the way he did not flinch when your gaze met his, the way he didn't blink. That look follows you even now, carved into the dark behind your eyelids, like a candle imprint burned onto the back of the mind. At first, your survival depends on movement, or rather, the lack of it. You become a shadow's shadow, a thing folded between crates woven into sails tucked behind barrels and beneath stacks of coiled rope. You ration yourself like contraband, 3 sips of water at dawn from a leaking jug, 1 crust of stolen hardtack when night falls, and the deck is mostly still. You think you are being clever, careful. Cleverness, though, is a shallow kind of protection, and carefulness is a fragile thing on a ship this full of secrets. One evening, if it can be called evening down in the belly of a ship, you are roused from a shallow doze by a sudden shift in the timbre of the sounds above. Not louder, not even more frequent, just different. Men's voices are pitched lower. The clinking of tools is replaced by a kind of drawn-out shuffling, and the bells, they are quieter, muffled, as though the very idea of noise has become threatening. You press your ear to the wooden slats. One sailor murmurs in a voice hoarse with tobacco, another taken by the black blood. Another replies with a bitter laugh. Then the tally's off again. Better he goes than a Christian. You don't know what black blood means. Not exactly, but you can guess. Something has begun to spread below deck, something not even iron chains can restrain. You creep a little closer to the partition wall that divides you from the hold. The lanterns on the far side burn dimmer now. Some are missing entirely, and the chains, they sound slower, less regular. The coughs are sharper, more persistent. You see hands reaching upward in the dark palms, open, not pleading exactly, but yearning. Then one of the crew enters the hold. He moves with reluctant precision, eyes narrowed, handkerchief tied over his nose and mouth. He carries a small satchel and a tin mug of what you guess is some sort of tonic. He does not speak, does not look anyone in the eye. He sets down the tin next to one of the slumped bodies, waits a moment, then turns and leaves. The moment he is gone, a whispering frenzy erupts. Hands scrabble, feet shuffle, but not all move. Some remain still. A shape beside the boy you saw earlier hasn't moved in hours. You begin to realize that the hold is thinning, not in numbers, but in noise. The quiet has changed tone. It has become a presence thick and deliberate, pressing down on the remaining living. By the time you settle back into your hiding place, your body is trembling, not from fear of discovery, but from something deeper, something that lives in the air. Now, like a shadow cast without a source, you are no longer just hiding from the crew. You are hiding from the dead, or the dying. The fever, you learn, has made its way up from the lower hold. Men are no longer jostling in the mess line or brawling in drunken rages. The deck is hushed, the laughter swallowed up by prayers muttered beneath breath. You hear arguments now more frequent and more desperate. One voice insists they throw the sick overboard. Another warns of Portuguese laws, of insurance contracts, of divine punishment. Another, young and shrill, asks if the sickness can pass through wood. No one answers. The crew has become aware that the cargo is infected, and when people are afraid, they do foolish things. Late that night, or perhaps early the next morning, the line has blurred so entirely now that time feels more like a suggestion you witness something that freezes you in place. A man is dragged through the hold, his boots scraping a slow protest against the floorboards. His body hangs limp not from death, but defeat. His shirt is soaked in sweat and something darker. He is left in a corner by the storeroom hatch. Just left, not tended to, not even checked. Left like spoiled rations. You realize then the crew is no longer trying to help. They are trying to contain. When the man stirs some hours later trying to rise, he is met by a crewman with a gaff pole. There is no shouting, no declaration, just a shove, swift and brutal. The sick man stumbles, slams into the bulkhead, and slides down silently. The crewman stares for a long moment, then leaves the hook dragging behind him like an afterthought. Your gut twists with nausea. You want to crawl from your hiding place and shout, or weep, or hit something. But you do nothing. You stay silent. You stay hidden. Because what else can you do? That night, something changes. You are moving through the shadows near the main mast when a hand darts out from behind a coil of rope and snatches your wrist. You stifle a yelp, turning sharply, and find yourself face to face with a sailor. His face is thin and sharp, his eyes sunken but alert. He presses a finger to his lips, then he lets go. He doesn't call for help. He doesn't raise alarm. Instead, he reaches into his coat and withdraws a bundle of cloth. He tosses it toward you and whispers, "Wrap your face, and don't go near the water barrel aft." Then he's gone, vanished like smoke into the gloom. It takes you a long time to understand what just happened. A crewman caught you and helped you, or at least warned you. You aren't sure why. Maybe he's too afraid of what else is happening on the ship to worry about a stowaway. Maybe he thinks you're a ghost. Maybe he just wanted to give something away before it was his turn to fall ill. Whatever the reason, you wrap the cloth around your mouth and nose, feeling the worn cotton cling to your breath like a second skin. It smells faintly of pine sap. You follow his advice and avoid the aft barrel. The next morning, Someone vomits blood into it. You have not seen the boy from the hold again. The lanterns are all out now, but sometimes in the quietest hours you think you can hear him breathing. A slow, steady inhale, then an exhale so soft it barely stirs the air. You listen for it like a lullaby. It becomes your anchor, the one sound that hasn't changed in this swirling, decaying world. But even anchors rot. You don't remember waking up. That's the most disturbing part. One moment your forehead is pressed to the rough grain of the deck's underside, your knees aching beneath you, and your breath fluttering inside the damp cloth tied around your mouth. The next you're simply aware of the damp, aware of the silence, and most disturbingly aware that someone is watching you. It's a primal instinct, like the moment in a dream where your legs suddenly won't move and something heavy is behind you, breathing down your spine. Your body remains motionless, but your mind claws forward, eyes opening in slow, reluctant slivers. What little light filters into the storage space comes from a lantern somewhere above, flickering through the slats in tired pulses. You turn your head only slightly, and that's when you see him, the boy. He is seated, no slumped against a thick beam, no more than 6 yards away. His legs bound in iron, his wrists resting across his lap, chained but motionless. He must have been moved. There's no other explanation. The hold's layout hasn't changed. You've memorized it by now like a rat memorizes its maze. He wasn't here before, but now he is. You freeze, partly in fear, partly in disbelief. His eyes are open wide and still staring straight into yours, without blinking, without even the courtesy of pretending to look away. His expression isn't angry, nor is it imploring. It's something worse. It's knowing. His presence presses into your chest like a rising tide, and for a moment you consider crawling away, folding yourself deeper into the barrels and sacks like you once did. But the boy doesn't move. He doesn't call out. He doesn't even shift. He just watches. You swallow hard, realizing you're trembling again. The cloth over your mouth has dampened with breath and now smells of mildew and dried blood. It clings like guilt. "You saw me," you whisper before you even realize you're speaking. He says nothing. His shoulders rise barely as he inhales a movement so faint it might have been your imagination. Then in a voice rough as salt-worn rope, he replies, "You see more than they do." You blink. "You're not one of them," he adds after a pause. "But you're not one of us either." There's no accusation in his tone, only an observation. You're too stunned to speak, at first caught somewhere between shame and fascination. You shift slightly, letting your legs stretch from beneath you, wincing as stiff muscles protest the motion. "I didn't know," you say. "It's a weak excuse, but it's all you have." The boy tilts his head slightly. His skin is taut over his bones, but his eyes hold a kind of depth you've rarely seen in anyone, man or boy, slave or sailor. He studies you the way a priest might study a sinner in the confessional, not judging, merely recording. "You chose this ship," he says. "You chose to run." You nod slowly. "I was desperate." "Everyone on this ship is desperate," he murmurs. "Some to survive, some to forget." Silence descends between you again, broken only by the distant creak of ropes and the occasional cough rising up from somewhere deep in the vessel. The fever hasn't relented. If anything, it's grown more cunning, more selective. The cook died yesterday, or so you heard from a whispered conversation between two sailors near the stairs. They've stopped ringing the death bell. The crew claims it draws spirits. "You speak my language," you say finally. "I speak many," the boy replies, "more than they expect." You nod again, awkwardly. "I never asked your name." "I haven't spoken it in weeks," he says. Names fade when no one says them. The words fall on you like a weight. You realize suddenly that this boy is not clinging to identity. He's observing its decay. He's watching who he was dissolve like salt in seawater, slowly, patiently, until nothing remains but memory. I'm sorry, you say, not because it changes anything, but because he deserves to hear it. He doesn't nod, doesn't thank you, just looks away at last, his gaze drifting toward the lantern light above. Sorry is like wind. It passes. You almost ask him what he means, but before the words can form, a sharp crack from above startles both of you. Footsteps. Heavy. 2 sets. One stomping authoritative, the quartermaster most likely. The other limping, uneven. You scramble backward, instinct kicking in. The boy doesn't move. His eyes close slowly, the way one accepts sleep during a storm. You retreat into the shadows, curling between bundles of sailcloth and crates of salted pork. The hatch above opens with a groan, and light pours down in a sharp shaft. Dust dances in the beam like lost spirits seeking form. Then the voices come. Another one down. Makes 8. They won't all last another day. Should dump them now. Burn the infected. Don't matter what the insurance says, dead meets dead weight. Captain says no. Wants them alive until Luanda. Price drops if they're sick, but still better than nothing. You strain to see, peering through the narrow cracks between crates. One of the sailors carries a ledger, tapping it irritably with his finger. The other points to various huddled forms with a stick, casually like choosing fruit at a market. This one's too far gone. This one's still breathing. Just keep them separated. And that boy, a pause. Still watching. That one's quiet but not dying. Yet. The stick pokes toward the boy you spoke with. He doesn't flinch. The sailors linger for a beat longer, then move on their boots, thudding away until the hatch slams shut again. Darkness resumes its throne. You emerge slowly, your limbs stiff. The boy hasn't moved, but he speaks, voice low and dry. They count us like barrels, like coins. You sit beside him, not close, but close enough to see him clearly now in the dim light. His skin glistens with sweat. You see the edges of his chains, how they've bruised and rubbed, raw the skin at his wrists. His ankles are bloodied, though he doesn't seem to notice. They're afraid of you, you say. They're afraid of dying, he replies. They think we carry death. You think about that, do you? He chuckles, but the sound is bitter, a laugh with its throat cut. We carry stories. That's what they fear most, that someone will remember. You sit in silence. After that, the two of you breathing in rhythm, your presence no longer an intrusion. There's a strange comfort in it, a shared, unspoken understanding that whatever else this voyage is, it has made you witnesses. He to cruelty, you to shame, but both of you now to each other. Eventually, he speaks again. I had a brother, he says, younger. He liked to chase crabs, laughs like birds singing. What happened? He shrugs. He ran. I don't know if he made it. You want to say something comforting, something noble, but the words feel false before they reach your lips. So instead, you offer silence, the kind that means you heard him, the kind that says, I will remember that too. Later that night, you return to your corner curled beneath sacks of meal and a broken crate of oars. You no longer feel hidden. You feel like a shard of something broken, drifting in the same tide, just floating differently. But as you close your eyes, the boy's words echo softly in your mind. We carry stories. That's what they fear most. And in that darkness, you begin to believe it might just be true. The days aboard the ship lose their names. There are no Sundays, no Mondays, no festivals or Sabbaths, only breathless mornings and breathless nights, only cycles of thirst and the dull ache of limbs cramped too long beneath barrels and boxes, Time becomes a hush, a fog that swallows purpose. You still move cautiously through the shadows, but the fear of being discovered no longer carries the same electricity. It has softened like salt, smoothing a wound until it is no longer pain, just memory. What terrifies you now is not exposure, but the understanding that nothing you've done has mattered. Not your clever hiding, not your silence, not even your attempts to rationalize what you've witnessed. The ship itself seems to exist in its own purgatory, drifting through time and space, unmoored not only from land but from conscience. You continue to observe from behind crates and canvas, and from this half-world of hidden observation, you see more than you should. You see men who once barked orders now sitting quietly against the gunnel eyes, sunken muttering to themselves. You see a sailor refusing to eat, staring at his hands as though they were no longer his. You see crewmen throwing dice, not for money, but for the right to choose which section of the hold they will be assigned to clean, because some areas, they say, have too many whispering corpses. They've started speaking of the dead in abstract ways as if detachment could ward off infection. They call them shapes and empties. They no longer say names. But even as the crew clings to their new rituals and superstitions, the chain bound below have remained eerily consistent. Some continue to pray. Some sleep endlessly. Some stare at the planks above, as if waiting for them to split open and let in the sky. Others, like the boy, continue to watch, silent, aware, breathing not in surrender, but in defiance. He becomes your landmark, your compass. Whenever the ship groans or shakes under the weight of the waves, or the weight of its own grief, your eyes search for him. And every time you find him still watching, as though he knows something you do not, as though he is keeping vigil for something long overdue. It is on one such day or night you can no longer tell that a new noise punctures the stillness. A bell, but not the ship's bell, not the usual quarter-hour chime or the dinner clang. This is something stranger, a soft, hollow tolling from deep within the vessel, rhythmic and slow. You press your ear to the boards, but it is not above you. It is below. You crawl cautiously to the grate near the lower hatch, the one you've always avoided. And from there the sound becomes clearer. A bell tied to the foot of a dying man. You've heard of this practice. Sailors call it the death bell tied to those too weak to speak a cruel mercy, to let the living know when the suffering has ended. Each toll a final breath. The bell rings twice more, then it stops. No one comes to retrieve the body. You stay awake for hours after that, staring into the wood grain of the crates, trying to keep your mind from unraveling. When sleep comes, it comes not as a gift, but as a thief. You dream of ropes turning to serpents of waves, whispering your name in tongues you do not know. You dream of the boy pointing upward toward a sky made of bone. When you wake, your throat is dry and your stomach curled in on itself. You crawl toward one of the water barrels you know to be safe, dipping your hands in and letting the coolness coat your lips. The first sip is ecstasy. The second is guilt. You glance over your shoulder expecting to see someone watching, but the ship is quiet. Later that same cycle, day or night, it hardly matters. You hear something new from the crew. Laughter. But it's not the hearty, reckless sound of drunk sailors. It's sharp, desperate, laughing at something that was never a joke. You edge closer to the slatted wall between the hold and the quarterdeck. Through a narrow gap, you see the quartermaster holding a ledger, its pages stained and dog-eared. He is speaking with the captain, who stands half in shadow, his hat low over his eyes. They're not all dying, the quartermaster says. Some of them are adapting. Adapting, the captain scoffs. Sleeping less, coughing less, watching more. The captain is silent for a moment. Then he mutters, "That's not adapting. That's waiting." Waiting for what? Land, justice, God, who knows? You wish they were wrong. You wish this were merely an illness, a misfortune to be recorded and forgotten. But you've seen the boy's eyes. And now, for the first time, you suspect he is waiting for something, and not passively. Later, you return to his side, careful to bring a scrap of cloth soaked in water and a crust of hardtack you'd found beneath the hammock storage. He doesn't speak when you place them beside him. He merely nods once. It is the most vulnerable gesture he's made in days. "You look stronger," you say, trying to smile. His voice is quieter now, but clearer. "The fever passed me. Others? Some are fading, some are changing." The word lodges in your chest. Changing how? He closes his eyes, leans his head back against the beam, and sighs. They dream louder. You want to ask what that means, but your instincts tell you not to. Some things aboard this ship no longer belong to language. Some truths have unmoored themselves from words. The next time you venture up to the deck for water for information, you find the crew gathered around a barrel. Inside lies a corpse, but not of a prisoner, a sailor. Young, his skin pale, his mouth open. His hands are wrapped around something, a charm or a relic. One sailor mutters he heard voices last night, said the cargo was calling to him. Another spits. Maybe they are. The captain arrives, orders the body thrown overboard. No rites, no prayer, just silence as the sea accepts what the ship could not. You retreat below, heart racing. When you next see the boy, you tell him. He listens, and then with a voice low and rough, he asks, "Would you help me if I tried to stand?" You hesitate, then you nod. Together slowly, you shift his weight, supporting him as he leans forward, then up. He winces, but does not cry out. His legs tremble beneath him, but he remains upright for a breath, then another. His face tightens with the strain, and you realize how light he's become, how close to vapor. But he stands. He stands. Then he slumps back down, panting, and closes his eyes. Soon, he says, and in that word soon, you hear something dangerous. Not hope, not despair, but certainty. The next turn of the sea, whether a day, a night, or something in between, is marked not by bells or shifts in light, but by a pungent change in the air. It begins subtly, as all dangerous things do. A faint coppery scent threaded with the sour tang of mildew and the unmistakable stench of spoiled meat. At first, you try to tell yourself it's only the stores turning in the heat, or a rat nest disturbed in the lower recesses of the hold. But soon the smell becomes something heavier. It gathers like storm clouds in the corners of the ship, particularly near the vents above the cargo hold, and it coils around the crew like a warning too foul to ignore. You stay low beneath a makeshift shroud of torn canvas and mildewed sailcloth, watching the movements of the sailors with sharpened awareness. Gone are the casual quarrels and loud boasts of strength that once echoed through the wooden skeleton of the ship. In their place is an uneasy rhythm of movement, quick glances, lowered voices, tasks performed with mechanical precision. Fear has changed the men. Where before there was cruelty born of arrogance, there is now suspicion, twitchy and restless, like a snake coiled in the dark, unsure of where to strike next. It is during one of these tense periods that you witness something unexpected. The quartermaster, normally a man of sharp tongue and sharper discipline, kneels beside a small open crate near the mid-hold. Inside are religious trinkets, wooden crosses, saints carved crudely in ivory, tiny bottles of holy water sealed in wax. You had assumed these were meant for trade or perhaps stolen from villages during the voyage, but now he moves through them with a trembling reverence. He picks one, kisses the cross, and mutters a prayer so quietly you can barely catch the words. He is not performing. There is no audience. This, you realize, is not for show. This is desperation. From your place in the shadows, you feel something you hadn't expected, a flicker of pity. Even he, a man who had barked orders for slaves to be scrubbed like livestock and measured like cattle, is now unraveling. The ship has become something beyond his understanding, beyond control. And what men cannot control, they inevitably begin to fear. In the hold below, the boy speaks less often now, but his silences feel weighted, deliberate. He watches everything with that same steady gaze, each movement, each change in mood among the crew, each whisper passed from sailor to sailor. He sees them fray at the edges, one thread at a time. And though he is shackled and half-starved, he carries himself with an unsettling calm, as though the ship's slow unraveling was foretold long ago. You bring him water now with regularity, careful not to be seen. Food is scarcer, but you manage to barter for scraps with one of the younger deckhands, offering stolen rum, a story about the stars, and once a carved token you'd found wedged behind a barrel. He doesn't ask where it came from. He only takes what he's given and passes you his crust. One evening, if one can still use such a word with any sincerity, you find yourself huddled beside the boy again. The dim flicker of a contraband lantern casting a trembling ring of amber between you. He breaks the silence with a question that feels like a blade, drawn gently across your thoughts. Why didn't you run when you saw us? You blink, unsure how to answer. I didn't know what I was looking at. That's not true, he says, his voice dry but steady. You knew. You just didn't know how to name it. You shift uncomfortably. I was afraid. And now, the question is simple, but its weight is not. You look down at your hands, filthy, scarred, still trembling faintly from hunger or guilt, or both. Now I'm something else. He nods as if you've given the correct answer, or at least the only honest one. Fear is a beginning, he says, not an end. You want to ask him what that means. You want to ask what comes next, what he expects from you, if he expects anything at all. But before you can speak again, a new noise tears through the hull. A scream, not of rage or violence, but pure, unfiltered panic. It rises from the deck above, followed by the rapid drumming of boots and shouted commands. You freeze. The boy's head lifts, ears keen like a deer's. You both listen. There is crashing, something large overturned. Then another scream. Then silence. You wait, hearts in your throat. Eventually, you crawl toward one of the narrow vents, the ones near the supply hatch. You peer upward toward the deck's edge. What you see turns your stomach cold. A sailor is lying face down near the mainmast, a trail of blood arcing from his mouth to the scuppers. His hand is outstretched, fingers curled around a dagger that has slipped from his grasp. His body is twitching, not from life, but from the delayed spasms of death. And standing over him is another crewman, taller, broader, red-eyed with sleeplessness. He is breathing, hard knuckles white around a bloodied pulley hook. His mouth moves, but no sound emerges. Then he turns and walks away, leaving the body cooling in the moonlight. You back away from the vent, hands trembling. When you return to the boy, you tell him. He nods slowly. It's begun. What as you ask? The breaking. You wait for him to elaborate. He doesn't. Instead, he lowers his gaze again and says, This ship is a grave before it ever docks. The days that follow, if they can still be called days, are a gradual descent into chaos. The crew is divided now. Some refuse to go near the hold. Others carry knives tucked in their belts where rum flasks used to be. The captain remains mostly unseen, issuing orders through proxies. his voice hollow as though spoken from beneath a thick veil of sleep or stupor. Food is rationed. Tasks are abandoned. Men begin talking to themselves in mutters and half-finished sentences. One spends hours carving runes into the mast, saying they protect against night voices. Another throws his boots overboard and claims the sea will carry him forgiveness. You witness it all, and you remain hidden until one night you are not. You are reaching for a scrap of bread tucked behind a barrel when a boot lands beside you. You freeze. Your eyes follow the leg upward. It's the surgeon. He stares at you with bloodshot eyes, a thin knife dangling loosely from his hand. Well, well, he says, voice hoarse. I thought I smelled guilt. You say nothing. Words feel useless. He crouches. How long? You hesitate, then whisper, since Lisbon. He whistles. That long, eh? And no one noticed. I kept quiet. So you did. He studies you for a long moment, eyes flicking to the scar on your chin, the salt-crusted hem of your shirt, the thinness of your wrists. Then surprisingly, he stands. Doesn't matter now, he mutters. We're all ghosts aboard this carcass. He turns and walks away. Just like that, your secret is no longer a secret. But no alarm is raised, no punishment delivered. Your crime has lost its meaning. The surgeon sees you not as a stowaway, but as another symptom of the ship's decay. That night the boy speaks again. Soon you won't need to hide. You glance at him. Why? Because they'll forget you were ever hidden at all. He smiles, and for the first time, it's not a sad smile. It's not even cruel. It's serene. You do not sleep that night. The wood beneath your body feels like stone, and above you, the stars seem to blink in patterns you cannot understand. The ship moves, and yet, it does not feel as though it is going anywhere. Each morning, or what you assume is morning, based on the dim shift in light through the grated skylights, the sails are adjusted. The compass consulted, and the helmsman sets the bow toward the African coast, toward Angola. But deep below the creaking deck, where you huddle between stacks of fermented meal and rotting netting, it seems more likely that the vessel is circling the same cursed stretch of water again and again, caught in some silent gyre of decay and delirium. The ship still floats. Yes, still carries the bodies of the living and the dead in equal measure, but its purpose has begun to rot just as surely as the fruit in the captain's stores and the faith in the crew's eyes. On this particular cycle of waking, you feel the shift before you hear it. The mood on board has turned again from fear to suspicion, something colder, tighter, more dangerous. No longer are the sailors merely avoiding the cargo hold and its chains avoiding one another's gazes or muttering prayers through cracked lips while clutching stolen rosaries. Now they are organizing in whispered alliances. They are tallying names, drawing lines, assigning blame. Something has been stolen, or so the story goes. A pouch of coins, or a religious relic, or perhaps a captain's promise, whatever it is, it has gone missing. And in a place already steeped in silence and sickness, a missing item becomes a kind of contagion all its own. You learn of it in fragments, overheard mutterings from men passing by a hastily sketched symbol smeared on the bulkhead near the quarterdeck stairs. A sailor throwing a glance over his shoulder 3 times before daring to speak. Accusations have begun to rise, not shouted but hissed, like venom sliding through fangs too tired for a bite. And the most damning rumor of all begins to swirl from tongue to tongue. There is someone aboard who should not be here, a stowaway. Your blood goes cold when you first hear it, not because it surprises you, but because you had almost begun to believe you were invisible. For weeks, the crew had been too consumed by their own dread, to see the shadows that moved behind their crates, too blinded by fever and fear to question the clinking water pail or the reappearing crust of bread. But now that the fever has begun to slow, now that the dead have stopped outnumbering the living, they have time to look. And you, who have survived all this time by becoming part of the ship's underbelly, may soon be peeled from it like a barnacle from an old hull. You stay low, breathing through the damp cloth that clings to your face like a second skin. The smell of sweat and old salt, now so familiar. You no longer gag. You move only when necessary, when the risk of thirst outweighs the danger of discovery. And yet, it is no longer just the crew you are hiding from. The boy, your silent companion in this descent, has grown stiller, not lifeless, but inward. Where once he watched you with those eyes like carved obsidian, he now spends long hours with his gaze fixed upward through the planks, as if he's listening to a voice that isn't yours. He speaks rarely, but when he does, the words are deliberate, like stones placed one by one upon a cairn. The ship remembers, he says to you one night, as you slip him a soaked cloth and a heel of bread so hard you could split wood with it. You crouch beside him, tired beyond exhaustion, and yet alert to every movement in the shadows. What do you mean? He doesn't look at you. Wood. It holds things. Blood. Salt. Voices. You frown, unsure if it's a metaphor or madness. He continues. When they carve the keel, they do it in silence. Did you know that? You shake your head, the gesture nearly lost in the gloom. No hammering, no speech, only breath. They believe if you speak while shaping the spine of a ship, you confuse its soul. You don't laugh. Not because the thought isn't absurd, but because something in the way he says it makes it feel true. On this ship, truth has become slippery. Lies rust like chains, but stories grow teeth. And this ship, you ask, what kind of soul does it have? He closes his eyes. One that was broken before it was born. The words settle into the dark like dust. You can feel them even after they're spoken. They linger. The next time you go to the upper deck, drawn not by need but by curiosity, you find the mood sharpened into something meaner. A group of sailors are gathered near the hatch, faces drawn tight with suspicion and hunger. One of them, a stocky man with a thick neck and fists like mallets, is holding a bundle of rags and shaking it in front of another sailor's face. This was hidden behind your bunk, he growls. It's not mine, the other insists, eyes darting nervously. The first doesn't strike him, but he doesn't need to. The implication is enough. Around them, the other men lean in, some nodding, some sneering, all hungry for something to blame. The word stowaway is whispered again, then louder, then with certainty. You slip away before it escalates. You retreat to your corner, heart hammering in your ribs like fists against a locked door. The crew is no longer content to let fate take its toll. They are hunting now, not just for stolen goods, but for order, for meaning, for someone to throw to the sea in hopes of appeasing the gods they no longer believe in. Back in the hold, you tell the boy. He listens, his face unreadable. Then he asks, "Will you run?" You shake your head. There's nowhere to go. He nods once as if he expected that answer. Then he says, "Then choose." Choose what? Who you are, before they choose for you. It seems cryptic at first, but later when the crew does begin searching below deck, lanterns swinging and curses sharp, you understand. They pass by your hiding place once, twice. On the third pass, one of them pauses. He leans down, squinting into the shadows. You are curled tightly, heart frozen. And then, just as he's about to speak, there is a noise behind him. A chain dragged purposefully across the floor. The boy. The sailor turns startled. You again? "I'm sick," the boy rasps. The sailor snorts. So's the whole bloody ship. But the boy doesn't flinch. "Take me." Not the shadow. The sailor hesitates, unnerved. But something in the boy's tone, or perhaps his eyes, convinces him. He turns and calls the others. Found another quiet one. They drag the boy up. You remain hidden. When you next see him, it's just for a moment. He's above deck, lashed to the mast. Not punished, just displayed. A warning. A reminder. You watch from the vent, your breath catching. He does not cry out. He does not plead. He just stares at the horizon. And you, hidden, still feel the burden of that gaze like an anchor in your chest. The boy does not scream when they tie him to the mast. He does not beg, nor does he protest. He does not even struggle. Instead, he watches them with the calm of someone who has long accepted that the world is built upon unequal stones, some born to stand, others crushed beneath. His expression is not one of resignation, but of eerie resolve. From the moment they lash his wrists above his head, with damp rope stained from the salt and soot of the deck, he becomes more than just a prisoner. He becomes a message. And like all messages that make men uncomfortable, he is placed in plain sight. You see him as you crawl to your lookout point beneath the hatch, grating your body pressed flat between the beams. Your bones ache from days spent hunched in darkness, but your pain is nothing compared to the silent weight of his vigil. He is bare-chested shoulders heaving slowly in the morning heat, his eyes trained not on the crew bustling around him, but on the sails, or perhaps the sun, or perhaps something further still, something beyond human seeing. No one dares meet his gaze. Even the quartermaster, who normally thrashes troublemakers with a switch until their screams echo across the water, avoids looking directly at him. It's as if the boy carries something dangerous now, not a weapon, not disease, but knowledge. And knowledge terrifies them more than either. The sailors do not speak of him, not directly. They make wide arcs around the mast, whispering with narrowed eyes and spitting over the rails as if trying to expel whatever poison they believe he carries. When they do speak, it is in euphemisms. The silent one, they call him, or that boy from the shadows. Some claim he never sleeps. Others mutter that he's not entirely real, that he was born of the fever. You watch as one crewman passes the mast while holding a piece of iron in his pocket, pressing it like a charm. Another ties a strip of red cloth around his wrist and touches it thrice before walking past. They are afraid, but not of death. They are afraid of what the boy represents, the thing they've been trying to ignore since Lisbon, now embodied in a boy who simply will not vanish. It is 3 days before they untie him. 3 long burning days during which the air thickens with storm anticipation and the sky begins to growl in low, hungry tones. You are not certain why they release him. Perhaps they think he will die soon enough without aid, or perhaps the captain fears retribution from whatever spirits might haunt the mast, but they lower him gently, almost reverently, and lay him in the shade of a lifeboat. No one binds him again. No one dares. You do not approach him that day. You merely observe heart, clenched throat, dry, your every muscle taut with a tension you no longer know how to release. And when the sky finally breaks, when the first crack of thunder shatters the torpid quiet, and the rain lashes the deck like an army of invisible whips, you feel the shift like a verdict. The ship, which has carried its ghosts so tightly in its gut, now seems to exhale. The rain is not a blessing. It is not soft or cleansing. It is wild, vengeful howling through the rigging with a fury that seems to awaken every buried sin, every secret folded beneath the deck. The crew scrambles, but their movements are erratic, uncoordinated. Many are too weak from fever or hunger. Others are simply lost, caught in their own terrors. The helmsman is found on his knees, weeping, clutching the compass, as though trying to will it to point anywhere other than here. You remain hidden, crouched beneath a supply crate that rattles with each wave's impact. Your fingers dig into the wood until splinters pierce your skin. Around you, the cargo hold groans like a dying beast. Ropes snap, barrels roll, and above it all, the storm screams. And somewhere in that chaos, the boy rises. You see it, from the edge of your vision. He stands slowly, as if drawn up, not by his own strength, but by something in the wind itself. He walks barefoot, silent, across the deck as men stumble and shout. He does not speak, but somehow the space around him grows quieter. The sailors part before him, not by choice, but as if compelled. He walks to the prow, stands at the very edge, rain cascading down his back, and raises his face to the sky. The ship shudders beneath him. You are not the only one who sees it. The captain emerges from his quarters, soaked, disheveled. His hat lost, his eyes bloodshot. He pushes through the crew, stands at the stern, and shouts, "Get him off the bow." But no one moves. The boy does not flinch. "Do it," the captain roars, voice cracking with something more than fury, something like panic. He's calling it. Still no one obeys. You know, without fully understanding how, that the captain believes the boy is summoning the storm. And maybe he is. The sea rises violently, smashing over the sides of the ship. Men fall. Sails tear. A mast cracks like thunder. And all the while the boy stands unmoving, like a figurehead carved from something older than wood. Finally, a crewman rushes him, wild-eyed, screaming nonsense. He raises a rusted harpoon. But before he can strike, the boy turns. Not quickly, not with anger, just turns slowly. Their eyes meet, and the man drops the harpoon. He falls to his knees, then curls into a ball, then begins to wail. The storm lasts another hour, maybe two. You cannot tell. Time bends in weather like that. But when it finally breaks, when the clouds begin to thin and the sun returns like a bruised coin, the ship lies broken in body and spirit. One of the masts is gone. 3 crewmen have been swept overboard. The rudder is cracked, and the boy is asleep. He is curled near the railing, head resting on a coil of rope, his breathing steady, his face peaceful. No one dares approach him, not even the captain. That night, you creep out of hiding. You move silently, your limbs stiff, your breath shallow, the air still thick with the taste of salt and fear. You find the boy as the moon rises wan and uncertain above the ravaged sails. He wakes as you near, eyes opening without alarm. He looks at you, and for the first time in days, he smiles. "You stayed," he says. You nod. So did you. He sits up slowly, joints cracking. The ship's almost finished. Will it sink? He shakes his head. Not yet. It still has a destination. You sit beside him, your shoulder barely touching his. Why didn't you run, you ask? He turns to you, because I wasn't hiding. The words settle in your chest like an anchor, but not a heavy one, a grounding one. And for the first time since Lisbon, you realize something has changed. Not just in the ship, not just in the crew, but in you. You are no longer simply a boy in hiding. You are a witness, and the story is far from over. The sea in the days that followed the storm lost none of its unpredictability, but it wore its wrath more subtly, no longer crashing down in thunderous fits of rage, but seething beneath the hull with a low and persistent growl, as though the storm had not passed, but had instead been absorbed into the very timbers of the ship itself, giving it a new, more sinister voice. one that hummed beneath every footstep and murmured through every snapped rope and flapping sail, as if the vessel were now a living, brooding creature, carrying within it the thoughts and sorrows of every soul that had ever stepped upon its deck and left behind a piece of themselves. The sky, though cleared of clouds, never returned to true blue. It remained stained with a sickly pallor, an endless dome of dull pewter that seemed to press down from above, with the weight of judgment reminding those aboard that while the sun may have reappeared, it had not done so with warmth or mercy, but only with the cold, indifferent gaze of something that had seen too much and had no more kindness to give. The crew, now reduced in number and unity, moved through the ship with the weariness of men who had long ago ceased to hope for arrival and had instead begun to treat each day of continued floating as a kind of postponement of reckoning, a delay granted not by design but by oversight, a clerical error in the ledgers of fate. Their eyes were rimmed with shadows, not merely from lack of sleep, but from the gradual internal erosion that came from witnessing too much suffering and being powerless to alter its course, and their hands, those once rough, capable hands that had tied sails and hauled nets, now trembled with hesitation, hovering uncertainly over ropes and tools, as though unsure whether their labor still served any purpose at all. Among these men who once swaggered and cursed and filled the deck with the boisterous certainty of men convinced of their own control over wind and water, a new kind of silence had taken root, deeper than mere quiet. It was the silence of souls learning to shrink of pride, withering of bravado, curdling into shame. They no longer shouted commands, but murmured them, as if afraid to rouse something sleeping in the hold, and they no longer looked one another in the eye, for fear of seeing too clearly the reflection of their own unraveling. Even the captain, once a figure of steely posture and clipped authority, now moved like a ghost of himself. His coat unbuttoned his beard, untrimmed his once proud voice, reduced to a dry rasp that issued orders with all the conviction of a man reading his own funeral rites aloud. And amidst this slow collapse, this collective unraveling of discipline and identity, you watched hidden yet increasingly less invisible, for while the crew had not yet named you, their eyes had begun to catch now and then on corners where you shouldn't be, on supplies that vanished too quickly, on the soft sound of breath in the dark where no man was accounted for. You felt their suspicion growing like mold beneath the deck boards, silent sour creeping outward in tendrils of glances and half-finished accusations. The whisper of stowaway returned this time, not as a legend or fear, but as a certainty waiting for confirmation. And with that certainty came a shift in posture, in the way men leaned on railings or touched their knives, no longer casual but deliberate, ready for the moment when justice, however unearned or misguided, might be carried out with steel and sweat and the desperate hope that killing one unknown would make sense of the deaths already endured. But even as that danger grew nearer, it was not the threat of the crew that filled your dreams, nor the lingering sickness, nor the ghostly cries that sometimes rose from the hold below, like echoes of forgotten names. It was the boy, or rather, the image of him, standing at the prow during the storm arms, slightly lifted as if balancing some invisible weight upon his shoulders, his face tilted skyward in communion with something vast and voiceless. That moment, etched into your memory like a sailor's tattoo, returned night after night with growing clarity until even in waking you saw it. His posture, his silence, the look in his eyes when he turned back toward the deck, not triumphant or afraid, but simply certain, as if he had seen beyond the storm to a shore no map had ever charted. You sought him now not out of duty or guilt, but out of something more troubling, a need to understand. And so you began to move with greater boldness, no longer content to scuttle like a rat, but walking upright beneath the deck, daring the shadows to betray you, passing men who glanced but did not speak, their eyes empty of the energy required for curiosity. You reached the lower hold where the remaining slaves, those who had survived the fever, the hunger, the voyage itself, now sat in a silence thicker than morning, a silence that bore the shape of ritual of resistance. They no longer cried out, they no longer pleaded, they simply waited, and it was this waiting that unnerved you most, for it was not the waiting of victims but of witnesses, people who had seen, suffered, and endured, and now carried within them a stillness that could not be broken by mere fear. You found the boy not among them, but apart from them, seated near the base of a shattered beam that had cracked during the storm. His chains had been removed by whom you did not know, and he sat now with his knees drawn up, his hands resting loosely upon them, his eyes not closed in rest, but open, unblinking, as though watching something just beyond the confines of the ship. When he turned toward you, he did not appear surprised, nor did he smile. He simply gestured for you to sit. You did. For a time, neither of you spoke. The creaking of the ship, the muffled coughing from above, the occasional snap of a rope were the only sounds. And then in that vast silence, he began to speak, not as a boy, not as a prisoner, but as something older, deeper, weathered by knowledge and grief. They think it is sickness, he said, his voice low and even as if recounting a story passed down for generations. But the ship is not sick. The ship is listening. You blinked, unsure how to respond. When my brother died, he continued, they threw his body into the sea like all the others. But he came back, not in flesh, in voice, in memory, in the way the wood groans in the night, in the shape the shadows take just before dawn. You frowned, not in skepticism, but in confusion. This ship, he said, was not built just of wood and nails. It was built of silence, of refusal, of the things men choose not to see. And now it remembers every silence, every refusal. You looked down at your hands then, at the boards beneath your feet. They say ships have souls, he added, but they forget souls can become angry. And with that, he fell silent again, not in weariness, but in completion, as though he had said all that needed saying, and the rest must be learned not from words, but from the unfolding of events. You sat with him until the lanterns above burned lower, until the sea shifted course, and the stars above peered through the narrow vents, like judges peeking into a courtroom. Later, as you crept back toward your hiding place, you passed one of the crew, thin, wild-eyed, muttering to himself as he smeared ash onto the deck in a circle around his boots. He didn't look at you. He didn't need to. In that moment, it became clear they no longer saw you as a threat. They saw you as another omen, another symptom of the ship's curse. And in that misjudgment, you found your new power not in visibility, but inevitability. You were no longer hiding to survive. You were staying hidden to see. And what you saw next would change everything. The sea, though deceptively calm on the surface, had begun to cradle the ship with a peculiar rhythm, one that was not entirely natural, less the gentle rocking of water embracing wood, and more the arrhythmic breathing of something ancient and ill, as though the ocean beneath had grown tired of carrying this vessel that now floated more like a rotting memory than a functioning ship. Each creak of the timbers echoed longer than before, stretching through the hull like a voice trying to escape the confines of a coffin, and the sails, once proud white wings pulled tight by wind and ambition, now sagged with the defeated posture of flags raised in surrender, their edges frayed their color, dimmed by salt soot, and a despair too heavy to describe with mere words. The change was not in any one thing, but in the sum of everything. For now, every bucket of brackish water drawn from the barrel tasted a little more bitter, and every meal of salted pork or dried biscuit carried the aftertaste of rot, as though the ship itself were slowly exhaling its last breaths into the bodies of those still unlucky enough to be alive within it. Above deck, the remaining crew thinned by disease madness accident, and perhaps something worse had begun to show signs, not just of illness, but of a deeper derangement, a spiritual unraveling that no surgeon could cure nor preacher absolve for. It was not the result of exposure or fever, but of some creeping rot that had settled into the marrow of their thoughts, stripping away reason and replacing it with superstition, delusion, and a brittle sort of paranoia that turned every crewmate into a potential enemy, every dark corner into a portal for curses, and every creak in the hull into the groan of judgment. The captain, whose name you had never learned, not because it was secret, but because no one spoke it anymore, had become less a leader and more a figurehead, a hollow monument to lost order, seen only when necessary, and heard even less frequently, his voice reduced to gravelly commands, whispered through the cracked door of his quarters relayed by the quartermaster or one of the two remaining senior crewmen, both of whom now bore the haunted expressions of men who had long stopped believing in the mission of the voyage, if ever they had truly believed in it at all. One of them, a gaunt man with a drooping eye and a hand permanently wrapped in a stained cloth, had taken to mumbling psalms beneath his breath as he walked the deck, while the other, a wiry sailor with a limp, had carved runes into the helm, claiming that the wheel won't obey without blood, though whether he meant the ship's wheel or some greater metaphysical force, no one dared to ask. You had been watching them all closely now, not just out of necessity, but because you understood something critical. The storm had not merely damaged the ship's structure, it had broken its spine. What remained was not a functioning crew upon a seaworthy vessel, but a collection of fragmented souls trapped inside a floating mausoleum, each man performing the motions of seamanship, not out of duty or purpose, but out of habit, like dancers continuing their steps long after the music had stopped. The boy whom you had once pitied and now found yourself quietly revering had spoken true. The ship was listening. It was watching. And more disturbingly, it was remembering. That truth became most evident on the evening the scholar began to speak in Latin. You had seen him before, a man of middle years, with hair graying at the temples and skin marked not by labor, but by the soft pallor of someone born into a life of study of ink and paper, rather than salt and rope. He had been among the chained in the lower hold, quiet but not broken, his presence marked by an occasional hum or whispered line of scripture, always delivered in a voice barely loud enough to reach even the ears of those sitting beside him. But something had shifted. Whether it was the fever, the hunger, the salt air, or the boy's influence, you could not say, but one night, without warning or prompt, the man had begun to speak loudly and clearly, his voice rising through the slats of the ship's floorboards like incense drifting upward toward heavenward. At first, it was simple phrases, et in Arcadia, ego and memoria, tenet omnia, spoken with the crisp diction of a cathedral choir. But then the words grew longer, more complex, spiraling into passages you did not recognize, laced with rhythm and fire, evoking names and places that felt as ancient as the bones of the earth itself. The effect upon the crew was immediate and visceral. Men dropped tools. Plates clattered to the floor. One sailor, already half mad from fever, pressed his hands to his ears, and screamed, "He's calling them!" He's opening the door before throwing himself overboard, his splash vanishing into the dark without so much as a ripple of resistance. The captain did not respond. The quartermaster locked himself in the storeroom with a bottle of spoiled rum. And you, staring up through the gaps in the floorboards, your breath caught somewhere between awe and dread, felt the chill of something more than mere language sliding down your spine. The Latin was not for you or for the crew. It was for the ship, and the ship you knew with a certainty that defied logic was answering. In the days that followed, the scholar was no longer referred to by name if he had ever been known by one, but instead was called the tongue or the chanter. Some swore he never slept. Others claimed he floated 6 inches above the floor when he spoke. A handful believed he had died in Lisbon, and his body was simply being used as a mouthpiece for something else. The boy, when you asked him about it, merely looked at you and said, "Not all chains are made of iron." His cryptic answer haunted you not because it was vague, but because it felt precise in a way you could not yet comprehend. And as you sat beside him beneath the broken lantern hanging from a fraying rope, the dim light casting your shadows against the curving hull like cave paintings from another world, you began to understand that what was happening aboard the ship was not a tragedy, not even a haunting, but a reckoning. Something buried had been disturbed. Something silenced had been heard, and the vessel, once just a tool of commerce and cruelty, had become a theater for memory retribution, and perhaps, if such a thing were still possible, redemption. The boy whose silence had once seemed born of trauma now spoke with the calm of someone who had seen further than anyone else dared to look. He told you stories not of his past, which remained mostly hidden behind a wall of careful omission, but of symbols carved into the beams of slave ships of sailors who dreamed the same dream 3 nights in a row and were then found hanging by their belts smiling. He told you that the ocean had memory, that it remembered every nail driven in hate, every body thrown to feed the waves, every name stolen and replaced with numbers, etched into ledgers and flesh. He told you the ship would not make landfall until it had been heard. You asked him what that meant. He said, "You'll know." And then, as if the ship itself had chosen to prove him right, something changed in the air. The sails, though torn, caught a wind that none of the crew had expected. The stars, long obscured by haze and the madness of broken men, revealed themselves with sudden clarity, and the rudder, cracked and neglected, shifted with a purpose not dictated by any hand upon the helm. The ship turned not violently, but with the surety of a beast that had scented home. But this was no return to order. It was a submission to fate. For that night, the scholar began to chant again, this time with names. Names that were not Latin, names that were not Portuguese, names that came from deep in the throat, heavy with earth and fire and the hum of languages older than cities. The boy joined him, not loudly, just a harmony, a thread. Others, those in the hold, joined too, one by one, and the ship, God help you, the ship began to creak in rhythm. You listened, trembling not out of fear, but because you recognized something holy unfolding in darkness. And in that moment, you understood this ship would never again be what it once was. Nor would you. You had come aboard to escape a debt. You would leave as a witness to something far greater, if you left at all. The air aboard the ship, thick with salt and smoke and the stench of men, long past the point of recognizing their own decay, began to take on a new quality, an undercurrent of heaviness that pressed not upon the lungs, but upon the very soul, as though the vessel, weary from carrying so much anguish and silence, had begun to exhale something more than mere heat or rot. A breath of memory, of judgment, of unfinished stories demanding to be told. Every surface now seemed to radiate with an uneasy hum, the deck planks warm with a residual tension that could not be chalked up to the sun alone, and the walls of the hold whispering in the night, their grains swollen with 1,000 hands that had touched them, bled against them, clawed at them in terror or despair or rage. It was as if the very wood had developed a kind of consciousness, not born of life, in the way that trees grow and bend toward light, but in the way that tombstones wear down more slowly when visited often, as though remembrance itself grants weight to matter. You moved differently now, not just out of caution or habit, but out of reverence, for the ship had become something else. No longer merely a vehicle of commerce or conquest, no longer a stage for desperation and cruelty, but a cathedral of sorts, a floating reliquary of suffering and witness and transformation. Each corridor was a nave, each storage room a chapel where the walls held confessions, and each groan of the hull a solemn hymn sung for the souls that had passed through unnoticed, unnamed, but not unlamented. You felt this not as metaphor, but as truth, as the kind of knowledge that enters not through logic or deduction, but through immersion, through breath, through sweat, through the trembling of your hands as you passed by a pile of coiled ropes and thought absurdly and without reason, someone died right there, even though no such death had been recorded or spoken of aloud. The boy no longer just a boy in your eyes, but something liminal, some bridge between this world and another, something carved from sorrow and starlight, moved with the grace of someone who no longer feared the shape of things to come. His body was still thin, still bruised, still clearly worn from hunger and pain and captivity, but there was in his step now a kind of rhythm that belonged not to exhaustion, but to purpose. When he walked, the chains of the past did not follow him. When he spoke, it was with the weight of someone who had been listening far longer than anyone else who had not merely survived the voyage, but had come to understand it in a way that no captain, no merchant, no priest ever could. He had become in the minds of those who still retained the capacity to think beyond fear, a kind of oracle, not divine, not cursed, but necessary. And it was because of this growing awareness, this dawning recognition among even the most jaded crewmen, that the boy began to receive offerings. It started with the simple gesture of a crewman, a former drunkard who had lost 2 fingers in a rigging accident and had not spoken a coherent sentence in 3 weeks, placing a dried apple slice near the place where the boy slept. No one acknowledged it. No one moved to remove it. And the next night, someone else added a piece of bread. Then came a strip of cloth carefully folded, a small coin, its edges worn smooth, a piece of carved bone, a broken comb. These were not gifts of pity, nor bribes, nor tokens of apology. They were offerings in the oldest sense of the word, objects imbued with intention, with memory, with the hope that by giving something of oneself to another one might be spared a greater reckoning. And though the boy never claimed these offerings, never touched them, never spoke of them, he also never rejected them. He allowed them to accumulate like the altar of a shrine that had no official clergy, but which gathered faith nonetheless. You too contributed. You offered the last copper coin from your boot heel, a worthless thing by monetary standards, but precious to you as the final reminder of a life you no longer lived. You placed it quietly near his resting place, then stepped back uncertain of what you expected in return, relief perhaps, or absolution, or simply the comfort of having performed a gesture of meaning in a world that had grown so utterly meaningless. It was after that, perhaps a day or 2 later, for time had again dissolved into a thick, sour haze in which dawn and dusk blurred together, that the captain reappeared, not just in orders relayed through intermediaries, but in flesh, in body, in presence. He came onto the deck in full uniform, though it hung from him now, like armor too heavy for his frame. His coat, once pressed and proud, was soaked with sweat and sea stain. His boots bore the cracking of neglect. His beard had grown uneven, speckled with streaks of gray and patches, where the skin showed raw, as though he had torn at it in some sleepless fit. Yet despite his dishevelment, he carried himself with a strange, brittle dignity, the way a condemned man walks to the gallows upright, composed already halfway detached from the world. He stood at the quarterdeck, surveying what remained of his crew, perhaps 15 men, maybe fewer, some leaning against railings, others seated on overturned barrels, none of them speaking, none of them moving to salute. The silence between them was not defiance, nor was it respect. It was recognition, a shared admission that the voyage, whatever it had once meant, was now something else entirely. The captain cleared his throat, the sound dry and hollow like paper tearing. "We are 10 days from Luanda," he said. No one responded. "If the winds hold." Still silence. Then from somewhere in the back near the old water casks, a voice called out, "If we're not already there." Laughter followed, not the joyful kind, but sharp, brittle, a bark of madness. The captain didn't react. He looked down at his hands, then slowly raised his eyes toward the bow. To the boy he said, and now his voice was softer, unsure, "He has seen something." It was not a question. It was not even a statement. It was a confession. And in the quiet that followed, you realized something you hadn't allowed yourself to consider before. The captain, too, was afraid not of the voyage's failure, not of mutiny, not of poverty or reputation, but of the truth that had taken hold in the marrow of his ship. He feared that the boy, the slave he had ordered chained, beaten, starved, knew something that could not be unlearned, something that once heard could never again be silenced. That night the dreams came to you. Not dreams in the conventional sense, not disjointed fragments of memory and imagination, but visions whole and coherent, unfolding with the clarity of prophecy. You stood not upon the deck of the ship, but beneath it, not in the hold, but in something deeper. Still, a hollow chamber carved from the hull, shaped like a rib cage, filled with water that shimmered like oil. There were faces in the water, hundreds, maybe thousands, drifting just beneath the surface. Eyes, open mouths, unmoving, as if speaking in a language that could only be heard with the heart. And you saw the boy floating above them, not swimming, not drowning, but suspended arms outstretched as though crucified in air. From his chest radiated light, not bright or blinding, but warm and gold, like sunlight filtered through honey, and the faces turned toward it slowly, reverently, as plants toward a sun they had never seen. You awoke weeping. When you found the boy that morning, he was already waiting. He looked at you and said, "You saw." You nodded. "There is more," he said. You didn't ask what. You didn't need to. Because you understood at last that you were no longer just a stowaway on a cursed voyage. You were the keeper of something vast and ancient and terrible and beautiful, something the ship had carried long before you ever hid within its walls, something it would carry long after it rotted to splinters and sank beneath the waves. And your journey was no longer about escape. It was about remembering. There is a particular kind of silence that overtakes a ship when the winds die. Not the quiet of peace or rest, but a suffocating stillness where every rope ceases its sighing, every sail hangs limp and defeated, and the water itself flattens into a mirror that reflects not just the sky above, but the expressions of those aboard who suddenly feel in the core of their bones that they have become adrift in more than just geography, suspended not in the sea's embrace, but in its judgment. That silence had now fallen upon the ship in full, not as an interlude between squalls or a brief lull in storm-born chaos, but as an oppressive, all-consuming pause, one that stretched across the decks like a burial shroud, muffling even the footfalls of the crew, who now moved with the listless resignation of those who no longer believed in purpose, only in procedure, mechanical, futile, as though continuing to act out the roles of sailor and officer and lookout might somehow prevent the truth from fully setting in that the ship was not only becalmed by nature, but held in place by something far older, far deeper, and far less forgiving. You, having spent so many weeks pressed into the damp belly of the vessel like a secret too shameful to speak aloud, now found yourself walking openly in the light of this stillness, no longer crouching between barrels or crawling beneath tarpaulins. For though the crew's eyes did glance toward you on occasion, it was not with the alarm or outrage you once feared, but with the same dull gaze they cast upon the cracked planks and frayed ropes, as if you too had become part of the ship's structure, another worn and inexplicable artifact that had always been there and might remain until the vessel herself dissolved into salt and silence. They no longer chased you or questioned your presence, not because they had accepted you, but because they had ceased to remember why they should not. In the same way that men starving long enough forget the taste of bread, they had forgotten the rules that once governed the hierarchy of bodies aboard the distinctions between captain and crew prisoner and free known and hidden. And in this new order, this liminal space where language lost its authority and ritual dissolved into murmur and gesture, the boy had become not just a symbol, but a center, a fixed point around which the slow spiral of disintegration and remembrance turned not by force of charisma or power, but by the weight of something less tangible and far more potent presence. He was no longer confined to the shadows of the hold or lashed in quiet humiliation to the mast. He now walked the deck when he pleased, spoke only when necessary, and sat for hours at the prow with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes scanning the horizon, not with hope, but with a knowing that made those who looked upon him feel as though they were being measured not by him, but by something speaking through him. The offerings had continued too, not just from crewmen now, but from others. You saw it one morning as the sky broke in streaks of bruised lavender and dying gold. A chained man in the lower hold, his wrists still bloodied from weeks of iron restraint, reaching out to press a tiny amulet carved from a shard of bone against the boy's arm, without a word. The boy took it not with thanks or blessing, but with solemnity, as if he were gathering fragments of memory, collecting them like tokens for a crossing, yet to come a passage not across sea, but through time, through forgetting, through justice. You did not know what would become of these gifts. Some were left on the deck, others vanished, but you began to suspect that they were not meant for the boy at all. They were offerings to something else, something that had begun to rise within the ship unseen, but undeniably felt. It was during this stillness, this breathless stasis, that the man with no tongue began to sing. He had been a prisoner like the rest, bound and nameless. But unlike the others, his voice had been taken, whether by blade or fire or disease, no one could say. His mouth was a ruin, scarred and twisted, and no sound had passed his lips since the voyage began. He had been marked as broken, ignored by crew and captives alike, until that night when the moon hung low and orange over the water like a blistered coin, and the ship lay so still that the stars themselves seemed frozen in place. And from the lower hold, rising like mist from the broken floorboards, came a sound, not words, not melody exactly, but a vibration, a resonance that hummed in the walls and passed through your skin like a memory of music rather than music itself. You had gone to the hatch with the others, not out of fear, not yet, but out of awe. And there you saw him, the mute man, kneeling in the center of the hold, his head thrown back, his ruined mouth open, and from within it, a sound emerging that defied description, low and aching, ancient and vast, as if the wind itself had learned to mourn. No one stopped him. No one dared. Even the crew stood silent at the threshold, some clutching their chests, as though remembering heartbeats they had forgotten, others weeping quietly without understanding why. And the boy standing beside him, eyes closed, hands extended, not in blessing, not in command, but in communion. When the sound finally faded, it did not end so much as dissolve like fog at dawn. The mute man collapsed into the arms of another prisoner, and the boy opened his eyes and looked at the captain, who had descended into the hold like a man sleepwalking. The captain said nothing. He merely turned and walked away, and the next morning the ship turned again, this time unbidden, the helm untouched, and began drifting west against the wind. It was then that you knew you were no longer on a voyage governed by charts and stars. You were aboard a reckoning. The crew grew quieter with each passing hour, their rituals becoming less about command and more about appeasement. They lit lanterns at the four corners of the deck, though no orders had been given to do so. They muttered apologies to the sea, to the ship, to their pasts. One man shaved his head and tossed the hair overboard as penance. Another carved his confession into the mast line by line until his knife broke and he continued with his fingernails. No one stopped them. No one spoke against them. The hierarchy had crumbled, not in mutiny, but in surrender, an understanding that the power that now ruled this ship did not wear a uniform or command a crew, but moved through the boards and breath and ballast like memory made manifest. And still the boy remained. You asked him once as you sat beside him beneath a bruised sky what he was waiting for. He turned to you slowly, his eyes as deep and dark as the water below. "I'm not waiting," he said. "I'm remembering." You did not understand, not fully, but the words settled into you like seeds, and over the next days, if days they still were, you began to see what he meant. You remembered. Not just your own story, though. It returned to you in flashes. The debts, the threats, the climb onto the ship like a thief, climbing into his own coffin. But others, too. You began to dream memories that were not yours. The cries of a mother as her child was torn from her arms in a marketplace. The hot sun beating down on shoulders bent beneath iron. The songs of a village silenced by the smoke of foreign sails. You woke each time with tears on your face, your hands clenched, as though still trying to hold on to something too precious to name. You were not the only one. Others dreamed too. You saw it in their eyes, heard it in their speech, fragments of languages no sailor had spoken, names never recorded in ledgers, stories passed from mouth to mouth in the darkness, each man adding a detail, a sorrow, a flame. And the ship listened. It remembered. Then one night, calm, windless, unremarkable in every way, save the tension that thickened the air like oil, you heard a bell. Not the ship's bell, not any bell you had seen, but a bell nonetheless. It rang 3 times, and then the horizon glowed. Not with the sun, not with fire, but with the faint ghostly outline of a coast that no map had ever charted. The boy stood, and without a word, the crew followed. The coastline that rose from the ocean's edge that night was not like any coast you had seen or heard described in portside taverns or sailors' yarns. And though no charts had ever borne its name, and no compass needle had ever turned willingly toward it, the moment it appeared glimmering with a spectral light, not cast by sun or moon, but seeming to emanate from within the very rocks and soil. You knew with a clarity deeper than reason that this was the destination the ship had always been meant to reach, whether or not its crew had ever realized it, and whether or not they still retained the minds to comprehend it now. The shoreline was distant, but unmistakable, rising like a mirage through a fog that did not behave like fog should, drifting not across the water, but downward, as if descending from the heavens, rather than rising from the sea. And the land itself shimmered with a muted glow, as though it were lit from beneath by embers buried just beneath the surface. Its cliffs and inlets etched with lines too deliberate, too ancient to be mistaken for natural formations, forming symbols you could not read, but which stirred something ancestral and uneasy in your blood. No one spoke as the coast came into view, not because they had nothing to say, but because language itself seemed to retreat in the face of what was unfolding, shrinking into the corners of the mouth like a frightened creature, hiding from the light of revelation, for words, however carefully chosen, felt insufficient, too brittle, too shallow, to capture the magnitude of what was being revealed. The crew, reduced now to hollow-eyed men with salt-dried skin, and voices turned inward from weeks of unspeakable events, stood along the railing in a strange, reverent silence, their bodies swaying, not with the motion of the waves which had grown eerily calm, but with the rhythm of something deeper, something tidal and ancient moving through their very bones, a current of knowing, of dread, of awe. Even the captain, once a man of posture and precision, now stood without his hat, without his boots, his coat unfastened and hanging limp as seaweed, staring at the approaching land as though he were seeing for the first time in his life something he had been denying for years, a place not born of maps, but of memory, of guilt, of legacy. You stood among them now, no longer concealed, no longer crouching behind barrels or creeping beneath canvas. And though no one acknowledged your transformation from hidden parasite to visible passenger, you felt the shift not only in your posture, but in the way the crew made room for you at the rail, their expressions not welcoming, not forgiving, but strangely neutral, as if you were no longer a question to be answered or a problem to be solved, but rather a fellow mourner at a funeral none of them had planned to attend. You realized then that the ship had not delivered them here out of obedience nor out of navigation, but out of inevitability. This place, this shore, had always been at the end of their journey, etched not into the charts they once unfurled over candlelit tables, but into the planks of the hull, the grain of the oars, the sinews of the sails, the breath of the dying. And now, as the anchor chain rattled down into depths that seemed to welcome it with a sigh rather than a splash, the ship exhaled once more, releasing a tension it had held for too many weeks, perhaps too many centuries. The boy, now standing at the very edge of the prow with one hand resting gently on the rail, did not look triumphant, nor solemn, nor even tired. He looked inevitable, as though he had been carved from the same wood as the figurehead beneath him, as though he had always stood there waiting for the world to catch up with the truth he had carried since the first chain snapped shut around his wrist. His eyes deep and dark and bottomless as the ocean itself scanned the horizon, not with longing, but with remembrance, as though each ridge, each shimmering cove, was a verse in a song he had been taught in dreams. The prisoners in the hold began to stir, not wildly, not with fear, but with the calm and deliberate gestures of people returning home after a long and bitter exile, their chains unfastened by hands that had once fastened them. The keys passed wordlessly from sailor to sailor, in a ritual so quiet and surreal, it felt more like a dream than a rebellion. You watched as men stepped up from the darkness of the lower decks, blinking into the strange half-light, their expressions not relieved, not bewildered, but strangely composed, as if they had already seen this place, in visions had already walked its shores in sleep. The scholar who had chanted in forgotten tongues stood tall. Now his back no longer bent, his eyes no longer bloodshot, as though he had been made whole again by the proximity of a truth too old for pain. The mute man with the scarred mouth, the one who had sung with a voice no wound should have allowed, wept openly, now his tears flowing not from sadness, but from recognition. And you, caught in the center of this procession of souls, felt your own feet begin to move, not by will, but by gravity, drawn forward by something vast and soft and wordless. The first boat lowered from the side of the ship did not creak as it should have. It descended as if guided by invisible hands, each rope taut with reverence. The crew helped the prisoners into the boat, not roughly, not fearfully, but as one might help elders into pews for a final sermon, their hands steady, their eyes turned inward. You saw the quartermaster who once barked orders with the ferocity of a man, always teetering on the edge of cruelty, lift a child you had never noticed before into the boat, with both arms brushing the boy's forehead with a trembling hand before stepping back. You saw the surgeon who had once dropped bloody rags into the sea like spoiled fruit, now kneel and kiss the earth of the deck, whispering names into it like prayers. No one spoke of staying. No one gave orders to abandon ship. It was simply understood the ship had brought them to the end of their path, and they would not be asked to travel further by sea. You boarded the second boat with the boy. The descent was slow, deliberate, filled with the breath of men who did not know whether they were descending into judgment or peace. When the boat touched the water, there was no splash, no jolt, only a stillness so profound, it felt like the surface of the ocean had become glass. The oars dipped into the water, not with force, but with grace, and the boat began to glide toward the shore, which grew clearer now, its edges etched with trees, whose leaves shimmered like metal, whose branches reached not up but out, as though extending a welcome. When your feet touched land, the sand was warm, not scorching, not dry, but soft and yielding, like stepping into the memory of earth rather than earth itself. The boy walked ahead of you, his steps unhurried, and the others followed, not in lines or groups, but in a loose drift like leaves carried by the same gentle wind, each person finding their own rhythm, their own direction, yet somehow always staying near. You turned to look back at the ship one last time. It did not sail away. It did not sink. It remained still and silent, its masts no longer creaking its sails, fluttering faintly like breath, its figurehead glowing faintly in the rising light. And then, for the first time since you had stepped aboard as a frightened fugitive in the middle of a moonless night, you understood that the ship had not been cursed. It had been witnessing just as you had, just as the boy, had just as every soul who had passed through its belly had done, and now its witnessing was complete. It had delivered the living, and carried the dead, and remembered them all. The land, though solid beneath your feet and spread wide with open air and silence, did not feel like the kind of earth one returned to after a long voyage. It was not the celebratory firmness of homecoming, nor the foreign curiosity of new territory. It felt instead like the surface of a memory, vast and strangely familiar, as though every tree, every slope of grass, every crag of volcanic stone rising from the red soil had once been part of a dream you could not remember until now. And though you had no name for it, no flag to claim it, and no map to trace it, there was no part of you that questioned whether it had been waiting for you. The landscape stretched not with the harshness of wilderness, but with a cultivated stillness not tamed by man, but shaped by a history deeper than story and older than language. The wind passed through the foliage in long, ribbon-like waves, as if it carried the breath of something slumbering just beneath the crust of the world, and in the air there lingered the scent of something both sweet and mineral, like fruit left to ferment in stone jars beneath the sun. The boy walked before you not quickly, not as a leader pulling others forward, but with the steady pace of someone returning to a place he had never left. His bare feet pressing soft impressions into the soil, not footprints exactly, but something deeper, something almost symbolic, an imprint of purpose, of remembrance, of continuity. And behind him came the others, no longer prisoners, no longer captors, no longer lost men clinging to fragments of order, but a procession of travelers stepping across the threshold of a reckoning they had not been prepared for, but were now helpless to avoid. There was no formation, no destination marked, but somehow all moved in the same direction, their bodies drawn by a gravitational certainty not born of logic or command, but of the knowledge that what lay ahead was not merely land, but culmination of the voyage, yes, but also of all that had come before it, and all that would need to be acknowledged in its wake. You passed between trees whose bark shimmered faintly in the late light, not gold nor silver, but a hue closer to copper, dulled by time and touched with salt. Their leaves whispered above you, not rustling, but shifting like silk, and the branches bent toward the path, not threatening, not grasping, but as though bearing witness, as though bearing the weight of what you carried. There were no animals in sight, no birds in the air, no insects in the brush, but there was no silence either, for the land itself seemed to hum a low resonant tone that did not vibrate in the ears but in the bones, like a hymn sung by the earth itself, mournful and beautiful and unending. When the trail widened into a clearing, you felt the change before you saw it. The way the light pooled differently, the way the wind stopped entirely, the way your chest seemed to tighten, not from fear, but from anticipation, as though the very air had thickened with memory. At the center of the clearing stood a structure, not a temple, not a ruin, but something between something shaped by hands, long since vanished, but preserved by purpose. Alone, stone columns, partially swallowed by root steps, worn smooth not by weather, but by passage, and an archway inscribed with markings that glowed faintly, not with fire, but with breath, as though the stones themselves were speaking in a language you could almost understand if only you dared to listen fully. The boy did not pause as he stepped toward the archway. Neither did the others. One by one, they moved forward, not as if entering a shrine, but as if entering themselves, and you pulled forward by a force that was neither external nor voluntary, followed your feet, moving not from will, but from recognition. Beneath the arch, the temperature changed, neither hotter nor colder, but deeper, as though you were stepping into the memory of the world itself. Inside the threshold, there was no grand chamber, no altar, no icon. There was only a circle, a wide, low depression in the earth, lined with stones and filled not with water or ash, but with dust that shimmered in the fading light, like crushed pearls, soft and pale and alive with motes of memory. Around its perimeter stood the boy and the others, their heads bowed, their eyes closed. The prisoners formed one arc, the crew another. No distinction remained. There were no shackles, no uniforms, only breath, only silence. Then the boy spoke, not loudly, not ceremoniously, but clearly, his voice like a thread weaving its way through each person present. "This is where we remember." His words echoed without echo, reverberating not through space but through time. "We carry it." He continued, "the weight of it, each of us, in our bones, in our blood. The crossing, the taking, the choosing to forget." You felt the truth of his words ripple through your spine like cold light. "No ship leaves the sea unchanged," he said, turning his gaze to the crew who met it without flinching. "No man builds a ship without knowing what it's meant to carry, even if he pretends not to." There was no accusation in his tone, only invocation. He knelt at the edge of the dust-filled circle, and with one finger he drew a symbol, a curve that looped back on itself, neither a letter nor a picture, but something fundamental. The scholar stepped forward and added a mark beside it, a spiral with 3 tails. The mute man followed, drawing a jagged line that split and rejoined like a wound healing over time. Each person in turn stepped forward, and with a finger, a stone, a bone left their mark in the dust. Not words, not names, but pieces of memory, gestures of recognition, echoes given form. When your turn came, your legs trembled, not from fear, not from weakness, but from the sheer gravity of it. You knelt and pressed your palm into the dust, letting it take the shape of your presence, not a drawing, not a message, but an imprint. When you rose, the boy looked at you, and for the first time since the voyage began, he smiled, not with triumph, but with tenderness. "You remember now," he said, "and you did. Not just your own guilt, not just your own cowardice, but theirs too. Theirs and yours. The generations that had passed it down, the systems that had made it possible, the silences that had enabled it, the erasures that had buried it. You remembered the sounds that had been stolen, the songs unrecorded, the names unspoken. You remembered the truth of the ship not as a vessel, but as a witness, a hearer, a holder of stories that had no other place to go. And now in this clearing beneath these ancient trees and before this sacred dust, they had come home not to be punished, not to be avenged, but to be remembered." As night fell, no one spoke. The circle remained intact. The marks glowed faintly in the moonlight, and above the stars blinked not cold, but gentle, as if nodding. That night you slept not as a stowaway, not as a survivor, but as a witness who had been given the privilege and the burden of remembering what others tried to forget. The night after the markings were laid into the dust was not like any other night you had known at sea, or even on land, for it did not unfold along the ordinary course of hours measured by the drifting of stars or the arc of the moon across the sky, but instead stretched in a way that was not temporal but spiritual, expanding outward into something timeless and circular, where each moment pressed against the membrane of memory and reverberated like the ripple of a dropped stone echoing across a lake that had never known stillness until now. There were no dreams, not because you did not sleep, but because sleep, as you had once understood, it had been transformed into something else entirely less a departure from the waking world, and more an immersion into the memory of all things that had ever passed through you, as though your body, your breath, and even your silence had become permeable, opening you not only to your own past, but to the lives and sufferings of countless others who had walked, sailed, wept, or been dragged along the paths that had led inexorably to that dust-filled circle beneath the boughs of whispering trees. You awoke, if it could be called waking, before dawn, your limbs coated in a fine layer of mist, your eyes heavy with the images that had poured through you. During the night, voices speaking in languages you had never learned, but somehow understood. hands reaching out across centuries to offer or take or cradle ships, both real and symbolic, burning on waters that screamed without flames, and a soft, persistent chant that had no beginning or end, but wound itself through every image, like a thread of gold spun from longing and grief. Around you, others stirred, not with the jerking start of those wrenched from nightmares, but with the slow, deliberate motion of those returning from deep contemplation, each face reflecting the quiet truth that none among you had truly rested, but all had received something essential, some piece of knowledge, some shard of perspective, some moment of grace that could not be spoken, but also could not be denied. The boy stood already at the edge of the clearing facing east, where the horizon glowed, not with the bright clarity of a sunrise, but with the muted, ember-colored warmth of something enduring and ancient, a fire too old to blaze, but too necessary to die. His silhouette was not commanding, not radiant, but grounded like a monument carved by time and memory into a shape that simply belonged, and as the rest of the company rose, some stretching stiff limbs, others simply sitting in silence, he turned and walked not back toward the ship, not deeper into the island, but along the outer edge of the circle, as if drawing its boundary once more, with his own body sealing it in, with the sacred repetition of movement, as if the act of walking itself had become a ritual of closure, of continuity, of sanctification. When he had completed the circuit, he stopped before the dust again, where the marks and imprints from the night before remained undisturbed, though the wind had passed through the trees and the mist had touched every surface. Not one symbol had faded, not one line had blurred. The dust had held the memories intact, as if the very earth had accepted its role as a vessel for truth, unwilling to let the story be swallowed once more by the forgetting that so often followed history. He spoke then, not to you, not to the gathered crew or the former captives or the island or the sky, but to all of it, at once, his voice gentle and slow but unflinching. "We cannot undo what has been done," he said, and though the words were simple, they struck with the weight of Scripture. "We cannot return what was taken, nor resurrect what was lost." A hush fell over the clearing, not silence but attention. "But we can name it," he continued. "We can remember it." He looked toward the sky, then where the light had begun to split open into threads of gold and lavender, pulling the night apart in slow, patient strokes. And if we carry the remembering forward, if we carry it with truth and humility, then perhaps the forgetting does not win. He stepped back. No one applauded, no one cheered, but heads bowed, shoulders softened, something deep and unseen released. You found yourself walking toward him, not with intention, not with any plan or purpose, but simply because your legs moved and your breath carried you, and your body understood before your mind that it was time. When you stood before him, he looked at you not with expectation or challenge, but with a kind of calm readiness, as if he had always known you would come, not because you were chosen, but because you had in your own quiet way chosen yourself. "What do I do now?" you asked. He tilted his head slightly. "What you always feared to do." You frowned. "What's that?" He did not answer with words, but with a gesture he extended his hand, palm up, and in the center of his palm lay a shard of wood, curved, blackened, familiar. You took it and understood immediately what it was: a piece of the ship, a piece of the hull, a fragment of the memory that had carried all of you here. And you knew what it meant. You were to carry it forward. Not the wood, not the symbol, but the story, the truth. You turned and looked back toward the ship, which still sat at anchor in the bay, untouched by waves or tide, as though the ocean itself had accepted that it must remain, not as a vessel for future journeys, but as a monument to what had transpired. Its sails hung like drapes in an old cathedral. Its hull bore the scars of storm and guilt and time. And in its stillness, it told the truth. You would not return to it, nor would the others. There was nothing left to be carried by that ship. The journey ahead would be on foot through time, through generations, through memory and struggle, and the labor of speaking what had been silenced. You would become the vessel now. And the boy who had been chained watched, beaten, revered, and remembered, would walk beside you, not as a guide, but as a fellow bearer of weight, of knowledge, of responsibility. As the sun crested the horizon, fully spilling light across the clearing and igniting the symbols in the dust until they shimmered like scripture reborn, the boy turned and began to walk, not toward the beach, but inland, where a path curved between the trees. One by one the others followed, not as pilgrims, not as penitents, but as survivors, as witnesses, as carriers of truth. And you walked too, your fingers tightening around the splinter of wood, the memory of creaking timbers and whispered prayers still echoing faintly in your ears. And though the road ahead was long, unmarked, uncertain, you felt no fear. Only the solemn, quiet certainty that whatever had begun aboard that cursed ship had not ended here, but had only finally begun to speak. The path that wound inland from the clearing, neither paved nor entirely wild, but traced by the passage of many bare feet across many lifetimes, moved not with the straight certainty of a road forged by conquest, but with the meandering grace of something ancient and sacred shaped, not by the desire for speed or dominance, but by reverence for the terrain, and a profound sense that some directions are chosen not with maps, but with memory. The earth beneath your feet was soft, dark, and fragrant, rich with loam and leaf rot, pulsing gently with the breath of a forest that did not merely grow, but watched its trees rising, not as obstacles or even guardians, but as witnesses, tall and unmoving, their canopies tangled like the hands of a congregation offering shade, not as an afterthought, but as an inheritance. Every step deeper into this place felt less like forward motion and more like descent into history, into echo, into the belly of time itself. And though you walked in silence, you were never alone for the rhythm of the others' footsteps, the brush of their bodies through the ferns, and the occasional low chant of the mute man who hummed with a resonance that seemed to animate the very roots beneath your feet, reminded you constantly that this was no solitary pilgrimage, but a collective passage toward something no longer hidden. Though no one had spoken since the circle and no instructions had been given, the group moved in a cohesion that defied logic or hierarchy. Sailors and captives, officers and stowaways, scholars and orphans, none bound by command, yet none wandering as though the land itself had begun to draw them forward in agreement, guiding them through dappled shafts of sunlight and under the shadow of hanging mosses with the invisible hand of recognition. You noticed that some carried objects from the ship, a wooden comb, a frayed length of rope, a nail turned to rust a sailor's pipe, carved with initials long since forgotten by its original owner, and even a moldy ledger whose pages fluttered like dry leaves in the breeze. These were not souvenirs nor relics of ownership, but talismans of accountability, reminders of what had been carried, what had been witnessed, what could never be uncarried, never be unwitnessed. You felt the weight of the splintered hull fragment in your own pocket, not heavy, not sharp, but ever present like a name newly remembered after years of forgetfulness. and too sacred now to misplace again. As the hours passed, or what felt like hours, for the forest canopy filtered the sun into a diffused haze that refused to measure time. Precisely, you noticed subtle changes in the air, the way it grew warmer, not with heat, but with depth, as though you were approaching the source of something long buried. The way the trees began to space themselves wider apart, opening the sky just enough to allow a glimpse of horizon. And most striking of all, the way the ground began to hum beneath your feet, not audibly, but physically, a subtle vibration like the echo of drums played centuries ago, still pulsing faintly through the earth like a heartbeat that refused to stop. When you emerged at last into the second clearing, larger than the first, and ringed with enormous stones, shaped by no tool you could name, you saw that the forest had not simply made way for you. It had delivered you here, as though the destination had been waiting not merely for your arrival, but for your readiness. At the center of this clearing stood a vast sunken basin, circular and ringed with steps like a council pit or an arena, though its purpose felt neither judicial nor violent. The steps, worn smooth by countless passings, led down to a floor made not of stone or soil, but of packed ash, fine and pale and cool to the touch, and within it faint shapes had been etched, not words but outlines, bodies, ships, birds, waves, all arranged in spirals that drew the eye toward the center, where a single stone stood upright, black and veined with iridescent lines like scars glowing in moonlight. The boy descended the steps, first his feet stirring no dust, his shadow long and straight in the angled light. He walked to the center stone and placed both hands upon it, not with drama or ceremony, but with intimacy, like a son returning to the tomb of a father whose voice he still heard. The others followed, filling the seats carved into the earth, sitting shoulder to shoulder in rows that defied rank or order. You took your place among them, unsure what would happen next, but certain that whatever it was, it had already begun. And then, without signal or warning, the boy began to speak, not aloud, but within you, his voice emerging not in your ears, but in your memory, as though it had always been there, waiting to be heard. He spoke not in one language, but in many phrases of Kimbundu and Yoruba, whispers of Portuguese and Latin, fragments of old seafaring chants and lullabies that no tongue had spoken in generations. Yet somehow you understood them all, not intellectually, but emotionally, as if the meanings had been encoded in your very blood. He spoke of the ships, the ones that had come before, hundreds of them sailing under flags now forgotten. Their holds filled not with goods, but with grief. Each vessel a floating graveyard that had fed the ocean more names than any war. He spoke of the captains, some who believed in God, some who believed in gold, some who believed in nothing at all. And yet all of them bound together by the silence they had carried, the silence of refusal, of indifference, of choosing not to know. He spoke of the mothers and the children, the traders and the priests, the chains and the ink, the lies of paperwork and the weight of sugar, the arithmetic of suffering that had made entire empires wealthy and entire continents bleed. And he spoke of the remembering, how it had begun with whispers, with dreams, with songs sung in the dark when no one was listening. How it had passed from prisoner to crewman, from stowaway to stranger, from father to daughter. How the land had remembered even when people had tried to forget, and how the ship, though built for erasure, had carried the memories faithfully across every wave, waiting for someone, anyone, to stop pretending. As he spoke, you felt the basin begin to warm, not with heat, but with presence, as if the very ash beneath you were rising up to listen to answer. And when he fell silent at last, resting his hands once more on the stone, it was not an end, but an invitation. One by one, people stood, and they spoke. Some offered names, the names of those they had lost or betrayed or never known. Some offered stories of beatings, of births, of secret kindnesses whispered through barred doors. Some wept without words. Some sang, and the basin accepted it, all the ash, holding their footprints, the stone holding their breath. When your turn came, your legs felt too weak, your throat too dry. But you rose, you stepped forward, you placed your palm against the black stone, and in that instant, every moment aboard the ship passed through you, the hidden hunger, the stares in the dark, the boy's eyes, the taste of guilt, the creak of the hull, the whisper of chains, and you knew what you had to say. I remember you whispered, and that was enough. The wind stirred then for the first time in hours, sweeping through the basin, lifting the ash into a gentle spiral that did not blind or choke, but danced around the group like a spirit made visible. The light shifted, deepened. The stone pulsed beneath your hand, and then the boy looked up. The sea has heard, he said, his voice now fully audible, deep and steady. The land has remembered. Now we must carry it. And with that, he stepped back, and the stone cracked. Not violently, not explosively, but with a soft, dry sound like bark splitting under moonlight. And from its center emerged a sliver of light, thin, golden warm. The boy touched it with 2 fingers, then turned to the group. One by one, each person stepped forward, touching the light not to take it, but to acknowledge it. When all had done so, the light receded,